Hello and welcome to another Java video tutorial. In this video we are going to extend on the work that we did in the previous video on validating user input. So if you haven't had a look at the previous video, I'm going to leave a link to that video somewhere around here on the screen, and I'll also leave a link to the video in the description below. And in the last video, we developed some code to validate user input. So we wanted the user to enter in an integer value on the keyboard, and we validated that input using a number of different techniques, using some try and catch blocks, using a while loop, and using a method whereby we converted a string piece of input into an integer value. So the first thing that I want to do is have a look at that code again very quickly to see how it worked. And for more detail, you can go back and have a look at that previous video. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that code that we developed and make it more modular. We're going to develop a class called keyboard that has that user input validation built into it so that we can reuse that class in other programs that we write. Because at the moment our solution is good, it works, but it's a whole bunch of code that we'd have to write in order to validate some user input. So it would be far better if we could package that up in a class that we could reuse again and again. So first things first, let's have a look at the code that we wrote in the previous video. So we have this program. The program has to happen to be called input test, or the class happened to be called input test. But what's more important than the class is the actual main method. All of the validation code, the user input validation code that we wrote, was all bundled into the main method of the program. And that's what makes it not so good. It's not reusable, right? You'd have to rewrite that code again and again every time you want to validate some user input. So let's just have a look at that code and refresh our minds as to how that worked. So the presumption here is that we wanted the user to enter in an integer value. So we have an integer variable called int num that's going to take in that input. We then had a string, because the technique that we're using to validate the user input is that we're reading in a string from the keyboard, and we're trying to convert that string into an integer value. So we use that string str input for that. We have a Boolean variable as well that controls the loop, because if the user enters in an incorrect value, you want to continuously loop around until they enter in a correct value or a valid value. We set up the scanner keyboard class in Java, so we use that to get input from the keyboard. So we set up a scanner object, and then we have a loop that basically keeps on looping around as long as the user input is invalid. When the user gives us a valid piece of input, then we can stop looping around. Okay, inside of the loop, so here's the loop, and inside of the loop we first of all prompt the user to enter a value. So that's just a message that the user gets. And then what we do is we take the input from the keyboard. But remember, instead of trying to read in an integer, what we do is we read in a string. The reason why we read in a string is because, well, a string can contain letters and numbers and symbols. So it's the most flexible kind of input that we can take in. So we read in a string, and then we see, can we convert that string into the required data type? In this case, it's an integer. Okay, so the actual conversion process happens here in our try block, and then we have an associated catch block that's going to catch any errors that might happen during that conversion process. Because if we cannot convert the string into an integer, a runtime error will happen, and we can catch that runtime error and let the program continue. So in the try block, as you'll see here, we have this line of code. which basically converts the string value into, well, it attempts to convert the string value into an integer value. And how it does that is that it uses the Java integer class. So the Java integer class is different to the basic int data type in Java. The integer class is a class and the int data type is a basic data type. So in the integer class we have a method called parseInt, and the parseInt method takes a string and it tries to convert that string into an integer value, and that's exactly what we want to use. So this parseInt method in the integer class is a static method that we can call just by using the class name dot and the method name. So because it's a static method, we can do that, and we can use that to try to convert the string into an integer. Now if that's successful, we set valid equal to true. So what that will do is it will stop the loop from looping around again, for subsequent iterations of this. So we'll stop the loop by setting valid equal to true. The loop will no longer loop around and the program will end. If the conversion is unsuccessful, what will happen is at this line in the program, at this point, there will be a runtime exception. We will catch that runtime exception here. We'll output an error message and we will continue to go around the loop. We'll iterate that loop or go around that loop again for a second time and a third time and a fourth time, as long as the user is continuously entering in invalid input. When we're successful, that loop will finish and the program will continue on as normal, executing whatever other lines of code are there. In this case, it's just a message to say the number you have entered, or you entered the number, and we just print it out to the screen just to give some kind of output to ensure that everything is working. So why don't we just run this and do a little test to see does it work, and it will also refresh our memory on the behavior of the program as well. Okay, so if we go out now to our terminal window, and what I'll do is I'll just compile this program. So javac input test.java. So we'll compile that and I'll run it, Java input test. So enter in an integer value, we get our prompt. So I will enter in an integer value, let's say 1. And so the loop only goes around once, it only iterates once because the conversion was successful. We successfully converted the string input of 1 into an integer input of 1. So our program works and the loop only goes around once, and we get our error, or we get our message at the end then to say, yeah, you've entered the number 1. Okay, let's run the program again and let's enter in the letter A, for example, which is obviously an invalid input. It's not an integer. And you can see that we get our error message and we get prompted again for some more input. For example, I could put in an @ symbol and you can see we get the error message again. I could put in an exclamation symbol and you can see we get the error message again. And I could go on and on and on like this. As long as I keep on entering invalid values, it will continuously prompt me until I enter in an integer value, like say maybe 10 or something like that. And then the program is going to end and I get my output. Okay, so I think we get the message there. It works, right? So what we need to do now is we need to kind of take all of this functionality and make it a little bit more reusable. Okay, because at the moment it's not reusable code. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create another class. I'm going to create a new file, and it's going to be a class file, and I'm going to call this file keyboard.java. So let's firstly do that. So I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it class keyboard. And I'm going to save this, of course, as keyboard.java. Okay, so I now have a class called keyboard. Now, if I want to take input from the keyboard, I'm going to have to use the Java scanner class. So at the top of my program here, I'm going to say import java.util.scanner. So there we go. We've got the scanner class imported there now, and we can use that. So why did I do that? Well, inside my keyboard class, I'm actually going to create a scanner object that I can use to read input in from the keyboard. So I'm going to have private scanner, and I'm going to call my scanner object in, okay, because I'm taking input. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to have a constructor. So I'm going to have keyboard, same name as the class, and the body of the constructor is going to create the scanner object for me. So I'm going to say in equals new scanner. And where am I going to take input from? I'm going to take input from the system input. So I'm going to say system.in. Okay, that's the constructor. So I've got my keyboard class, and in my keyboard class, what have I got so far? I've got a data member, which is the scanner object. I've got a constructor, and in the constructor, it's going to create the scanner object that I will use in the class to read in input. Okay, what else do I want to do? Well, what might I want to do with the keyboard class? Well, I want to read in integers. I might want to read in double values. I might want to read in lots of different values. Let's stick with integer for the moment because that's what we had in our last example. So I'm going to create a method in the keyboard class to read in an integer value from the keyboard, and of course this will be validated input. So I'm going to say public because it's going to be a public method. I want to read in an integer value, so I want this method to return an integer. So the return type is going to be int, and then the name of the method is just going to be read integer. Okay, so what parameters do I want this method to take? Well, let's go back and have a look at the previous program, and we'll see the behavior. We'll have a look at the behavior of that and try and match that to this method, or try and match this method to the behavior of the previous program. So just let's go back here and have a look at this. So as you can see, we set up all of the validation variables that we needed. We created the scanner class, and then kind of the first thing that we do is we prompt the user to enter in a particular value, in this case an integer value. So there's a prompt to the user there. That is part of the behavior of how this works. Then we have all of the stuff where we try and grab the input and do the conversion, and then we have an error message that we display to the user here if the user enters in some invalid input. So we'd like to kind of mirror that behavior in the method that we're developing now in the keyboard class. So if I go back to the keyboard class, in this method that I have here called read integer, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up two parameters for this method. The first parameter is going to be, I'm going to call it the prompt, and the second parameter is also going to be a string, two string parameters, and I'm going to call this error. Or I could call it prompt message, let's say an error message. Okay. Alright, so what is going to be in the body of this read integer method? Well, guess what? I have most of the code already written because, you know, we did it before. We have it in the last program that we wrote. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go again back to that last program that we developed. And I'm just going to copy most of that code into the read integer method for the keyboard. So here we go. I'm going to copy everything right down to the very last bracket in that signifies the end of that while loop. Okay, so all of that code, all of the variables that I declared, and the while loop, everything in that block, I'm going to copy that and I'm going to bring it over into my new keyboard class, and I'm going to literally just copy, or I'm going to paste it into the read integer method. Okay, so let's have a look, and we'll go down through the lines of code and see what we need to keep and see what we need to get rid of, because there's 1 or 2 lines in here that we don't need, and another couple of lines that we need to add in order to get this to work. Okay, so we still need this integer value. Yes, we still need this string value. Yes, because we're doing the same process. We still need this Boolean value. Now, do we need to set up a scanner class? Do we need to set up a scanner object? Well, the answer to that is no, because we already in the constructor are setting up a scanner object to use. So I can actually get rid of these 2 lines of code. All right, we need our loop. Yes, we need to keep that. We need to prompt the user, but if you have a look at the code that I copied across, it has a hard-coded message in here for the prompt, right? And I want to make this method as flexible and reusable as possible. And to do that, I have created these 2 parameters for the method here, the prompt message and the error message. So rather than hard code a string into this prompt the user part of the code, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of that hard-coded string literal, and I'm going to put my parameter in here, my formal parameter in there, and it's going to print out the prompt message that I give to the method when I call it, right? Okay, so the next thing is I need to grab input from the keyboard. That's going to be the same, and we're grabbing a string, and then we're going to try and convert it to an integer. So the try block will be the same. There's nothing that needs to be changed there. And then the catch block will be the same, apart from, again, the error message. It's hard coded, and I don't want it hard coded. I want it to be flexible. So I'm going to use my formal parameter that I got passed over for the error message, and that's called error message. Change that line of code. Okay, what else do I need to do? Well, once this loop has finished, this is really the core of the read integer method, okay? When that loop has finished, I will have a valid entry from the keyboard, a valid integer entry from the keyboard, and it will be stored in this local variable here called num, right? So when the loop finishes, what I need to do is I need to return that number, okay? So I'm gonna have a line of code in here, return num. All right, so that's it. That's all I need to do for this read integer method. I had most of the code already written, but it's just packaging it up in a reusable way in this keyboard class and parameterizing the method and giving like a string for the prompt and a string for the error message. That's going to make this really flexible because I can use it now in another program. So let's, I'm going to save this first. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure it compiles. So I'm going to go out to my terminal window here and make sure it compiles javac keyboard.java. Okay, everything compiles, looks good. We need to test it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a separate test program to test out the keyboard class. So I'm going to create another file here, another Java file. I'm going to say file, create a new file here, and this one is going to be called class keyboard test. And of course I'm going to save that as keyboard test.java. So I'll say file, save as. And I'm going to call this keyboard test.java. And in this keyboard test class, I'm just going to have a main because this is going to be the program that I'm going to run to try and test out the keyboard class. So I'll have public static void main, all the usual stuff. And inside of the main, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a keyboard object, because remember I just developed this keyboard class and I want to test it out and use it. So I'm going to create a keyboard object. And to do that, I'm going to say keyboard, and I'm going to call my object KB. Keyboard, keyboard KB equals new keyboard. My constructor for my keyboard class doesn't take any parameters, so I don't need to pass anything over there. And then what I need to do is, well, I want to test out the read integer method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up some variables here. So I'm going to say int, and I'm going to call this variable int input. Okay, so int input, and I'm also going to set up some strings for the prompt and for the error message. So I'll say string, and I'll call this one prompt message 1, and I'll just say, so this will be just enter an integer value. Okay, enter an integer value, and then I'll have string error, error message 1, and I'll say invalid, let's say invalid entry, enter an integer value. Spell value correctly. Okay. All right, so that looks good. So I have a string for the prompt, enter an integer value, and then a string for the error message, invalid entry, enter an integer value. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to test out the read integer method of the keyboard class. So how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to say int input, this integer variable that I have, int input equals kb dot read integer, and I'm going to pass over my prompt message, so prompt message 1, and the error message that I want to use is error message 1. Okay, and then what do we want to do next? Well, if this works, I need some way to check to see if it's worked or not. So why don't I just output the value of int input, my variable. So system dot out dot println, and I'll just say you entered the value, and in this case it's going to be int input. Okay, so what am I doing here? All right, I've got, this is like a little test case, you know, for my keyboard class, right? So, you know, I could call this test case 1, read integer. Okay, and I've got an int that I'm going to read, that I need to get a value into. I've got my prompt message and my error message, and then I'm going to make a call to read integer, and then I just have some output here to verify that the thing has worked. Okay, so just like a little test case that I'm building up here for the read integer method. Okay, so once that's done, I should be able to compile that now. So Java C keyboard test.java. Everything works, everything compiles, and let's run it and see what happens. So Java keyboard test. Okay, so we get a prompt, everything is looking good so far. we get a prompt to enter in a value. So let's get it right first time. Enter in the value 100. Okay, good stuff. We get a confirmation message here to say you entered the value 100. So that looks good. Okay, let's run it again. And let's enter in the value or the letter A. Okay, so that looks good. Invalid entry, enter an integer value. Okay, let's enter in, let's get it wrong again. Let's enter in an @ symbol. Okay, we get the error message again. That looks good. And this time let's enter in, say, 200. Press enter, and yes, you entered in the value 200. So you can see that it's working. And really all of the work and all of the user input validation stuff that's happening is in this one call now to kb.readInteger. Okay, so it's all packaged up and reusable. If I want to enter in another value from the keyboard, I just have to call that method again on the keyboard class. So I just can reuse it again and again as many times as I want, with different prompt messages, with different error messages. It's all very flexible and I can reuse it. So what else might I want to do with this keyboard class, as well as reading in integers, right? One of the other common things that we do in our programs is we might want to read in a decimal value from the keyboard. So let's see how we could do that. It's actually quite easy to do. Now that we've got the read integer working, we can just kind of do the same for reading in a double, for example, except we just have to change around some of the data types. So let's go back to the keyboard class, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically copy the read integer method from in the keyboard class. I'm just going to copy that and make a bit of space underneath that, and I'm going to paste it in there, and I'm going to change the name of the method. Instead of saying read integer, I'm going to change the name of the method to say read, well, I'll spell double, right? That would be helpful. Read double. Okay, now the read double is going to give me back a double value, right? A decimal value. So I need to change the return type here. It's not going to be int, it's going to be double. Why can't I spell double right today? Okay, there we go, double. Okay, are we going to have a prompt? Yes, that's going to be the same. Are we going to have an error message? Yes, that's going to be the same. Let's go into the body of this method and see what we need to change. Well, straight off there, we've got an integer variable that's declared. Now, are we interested in integers here? No, we want to read in a double value. So this number variable here is not going to be of type int. It's now going to be of type double. We still need the string, because remember, we're still getting string input, and now we're going to try and convert the string from not to an integer but to a double. But we still need to take the string input. We still need the boolean. We still need the loop. Everything is going to be the same. The prompt to the user is there, and we use our argument that gets passed over the prompt message. We still need to grab a string from the keyboard, still inputting a string, but in the try block, we need to change the try block, because in the try block, we previously converted from a string to an integer. Now we need to convert from a string to a double. Now, just like there is an integer class in Java, there is also a double class in Java, and the double class in Java also has a parse method, and this parse method is called, the method that we're going to use is called parse double, and that takes a string and it tries to convert that string from a string value to a double value, a decimal value. So this is the line of code that we need to change, this conversion line of code. So instead of saying num equals integer, it's now going to be the double class in Java dot parse, and it's not parse int, because we're not trying to convert from a string to an int, we're trying to convert from a string to a double, so it's going to be parse double. And that's okay, yeah, that should work. And we still need to set valid equal to true, as long as that line of code executes correctly and doesn't cause a runtime exception. We set valid equal to true, and then we have our catch block here, and our catch block is going to print out our error message, And then finally, this line of code after the loop, once the loop finishes, we'll have our valid value, and we just return that, and we return the num there, which is our variable, our local variable up here, which is now a double instead of an integer. So that's all we need to do. As easy as that. Just change some data types around, change the conversion process around, and we now have a redouble method that we can use in our keyboard class as well. So let's save that, and let's go out to our terminal window and make sure that compiles. First of all, javac keyboard.java, all compiles. That looks good. Let's go test that out now in our keyboard test program. So we have this little test case here for a read integer. Why don't we copy that? I'm going to copy that test case down, and I'm now going to call this test case 2, and we're going to test out redouble, and we are going to have a double instead of an int here, our variable. So this, I'll rename this to double input. Our string prompt message 1, I'm going to rename that now to prompt message 2 and error message 2. So I'll have different prompts and different error messages, and this prompt is going to say enter a double value, and the error message 2, invalid entry, enter a double value. Okay. And then instead of using the read integer method here, I'm going to also change this to read double. So we're going to make a call to the read double method. So we're going to have int in, well, it's not going to be int input, it's going to be double input equals kb dot, instead of read integer, it's going to be read double. Okay, so we're changing here this line of code. And the prompt message, well, it's not going to be prompt 1, it's going to be prompt 2, and it's going to be error message 2. Okay, so that's that line of code changed. And then the output, let's have a look. Do we need to change the output? You entered the value. Yes, we need to change this variable, not int input. We need to output the variable double input to verify that the method is working correctly. So I'll save this. Okay, and we'll recompile that, test it out, see does it work. Keyboard test.java compiles. Let's see, does it work? Java keyboard test dot, oh, I don't need the .java, so I'm running the program. Java keyboard test. Okay, enter an integer value. So we're still going through the first test case. We know that that works already. I'll just enter in an integer value and we can continue on. So it says you entered the value 1. It's fine, it works. Now we have our next test case, enter a double value. Okay, let's get this wrong first. I'm going to enter in the @ symbol. Okay, invalid entry, enter a double value. Good, that works. Let's enter the letter A. Okay, error message again, invalid entry, enter a double value. Okay, so let's enter a double value, 2.5. That's a double, isn't it? That's a decimal value, 2.5. And I hit enter again, and you can see you entered the value 2.5. So the program finishes, test case works because 2.5 can be converted into a double value. Now, interestingly enough, let's run the program again. Okay, so this is the first test case. Let's get by that. I'll enter in the value 1. Enter in a double value. What about if I entered in the value 5? Okay, so remember, we're taking string input and we're going to try and convert that input to a double value. Now, even though I haven't entered in a decimal point, even though I haven't entered in 5.0, will this work? Will just entering the number 5, will that be successfully converted from a string that contains the digit 5 into a double value? Well, let's see. And yes, it does. Because you see, look, I entered the value 5. Remember, that's a string that contains the digit 5. But can that digit 5 be converted to a double value? Yes, it can. It's simply 5.0. And you can see the output that I get is 5.0 because I'm outputting a double, right? So everything is working. I've got a read integer, I've got a read double, I've got my two test cases, and you can see that the two methods now are working, and you can see it's very easy to reuse these. I can use them anytime I want to request input from the keyboard and validate that input. But I can go a step further, because what about if I wanted to say maybe enter in an integer, validate that it is an integer, but I want to have input within a certain range. Let's say I wanted to force the user to enter in a number between 1 and 10, and I don't want them to enter in any other values. It has to be between 1 and 10, and I could have that as an inclusive range, including 1 and including 10. How would I do that? Well, I have most of the work done already. All I need to do is add an extra little bit of criteria to the user input validation routine, and once I do that, then I have that method. So let's go back to the keyboard class and see how we would be able to do that for, let's say, reading in an integer. You'd also be able to do it for reading in a double. You can apply the same changes to the double method, but we'll just do it for the integer input first, and we'll see how it works, but it can be easily applied to reading in double values as well. Okay, go back to the keyboard class, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the read integer method in the keyboard class. I'm going to copy the entire method. Okay, I'm going to copy the entire method, and I'm going to simply paste the entire method in underneath the original one. So there's the first one, and then I've copied a complete copy of it right in here underneath that one. So what I'm going to do here is, even though I have a complete copy of that method, I'm going to change around the parameter list a little bit, because this version of the read integer method is going to take 2 additional parameters, and those parameters are going to allow me to specify a range of valid input. So I'm going to add in, on this second version of the read integer method, I'm going to add in this parameter int low and also int high. Okay, so how does this work? Well, in Java, in the class keyboard, I have this version of the read integer method that takes 2 parameters, 2 string parameters, and now I've got this second version of the read integer method that takes my 2 string parameters and also now my additional 2 parameters of low and high. So when I make a call to the read integer method from the keyboard class, Java will try and match the parameter lists that I'm using when I make the call to the correct version of the read integer method in the keyboard class. So I'm overloading the read integer method in the keyboard class, and it's now got 2 versions of it, if you like, and the one that will get used is based on whatever parameters I pass over to it from whatever program I'm writing that's going to use the keyboard class. So, okay, how is this going to work? This second version with these additional 2 parameters here of int low and high. Well, let's go down through the code again and see where we need to make the changes. Really, if we leave everything the same, all of this code is going to be the same. There's going to be nothing unusual about that. But right down here in the try block, this is where we need to make the change, okay? So once we convert the string to an integer value, once that successfully happens, then I have an integer value, right? And that integer value is going to be stored in my num variable. So what I can do after that line of code is I can put in the additional criteria that I need to validate that input. And that is, I want to check to see if the number that the user has input is within the range of values that I've got specified by the low and the high parameters. So I need an if statement. I need a conditional block to do that. So I'm going to say if, and I'm going to check to see if num is greater than or equal to low. So I'm going to be inclusive in the range. It's going to be greater than or equal to low, and num less than or equal to high. Now, if the number is in that range, if that if statement, if the Boolean condition in that if statement evaluates to true, then it's a valid number. It has been already validated as an integer number, and it's inside the range that I've specified. So in that case, I want to set valid equal to true. So I'm finished looping around. I don't need to do any further validation. I'm going to set valid equal to true, and that will be that. We're done. Else, if it's not in the range, if it's not inside that range, if it's outside of that range, what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to actually print an error message here. And I'm going to print the same error message that I would have in the try and catch block. I'm going to copy that error message, and I'm going to put that error message here in this else part of the if statement. So I'll explain why I'm doing that. Remember, this catch block only comes into play if the conversion process cannot take place. So if this line of code causes a runtime exception because it cannot convert whatever the string contents are into an integer, then that will cause a runtime exception, and my catch block comes into play, and I get my error message. Okay. However, if that conversion process does take place and it's successful, then that catch block doesn't actually come into play. So once this line of code executes, the catch block is redundant. It's never going to execute. Okay, so if the number is inside the range that I've specified, then I set valid equal to true. But if it's not, I need to output my error message, because the catch block isn't going to do it. Okay, so I need to kind of have that error message printed here again in this else branch of the conditional block. Okay, so that's why I have that there. Okay, will that work? It should work. Let's see. Let's test it out. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to go out to my terminal window again, and I'm going to recompile my keyboard class. Okay, recompile javac keyboard.java. Compiles properly. And now we need to set up a test case for this particular method, this new read integer method with the high and the low. Okay, so I'm going to go back into my keyboard test program, and I'm going to copy my first test case because that was the read integer one. So I'm going to copy that one, and I'm going to have a third test case down here. So test case 3, and this is going to be read integer with low and high parameters. Okay, and I'm going to have again an integer input. Just to keep everything separate though, I'll call this int input 2. Okay, int input 2. I'll have a separate prompt message. I'll just keep everything separate. So this is going to be prompt message 3, and this is going to be error message 3, and of course this is going to be enter in an integer value in the range. So my prompt is going to be in the range 1 to 10. Okay, so that's going to be my range 1 to 10, just as a test case. And then my error message is going to be invalid entry, enter an integer value in the range 1 to 10. So making sure my error message is informative to the user so they know what they've done wrong, because otherwise we could be here forever. Okay, so an informative error message there to tell the user what they've done wrong. And then I need to make a call to my read integer. So call to read integer with low and high. So this call is going to use the variable int input 2, because I'm keeping my test cases separate. So int input 2, and then I'm going to say kb.readInteger prompt message 3 and error message 3. Now I have to specify these additional parameters, the low and the high. So I'm just going to pass these values over as constants to this read integer method. So well, what do I want? Well, on my prompt says in the range 1 to 10, so I've got to use the values 1 to 10 for my low and high here when I make the call to the method. So I'm going to pass over the value 1 for low and 10 for the high. So now that's it. That's basically the call to it there, and it's got its prompt, it's got its error message, and it's got its low and its high values for that additional criteria around the user input. And we have to change the output. Output system.out.println. You entered the value, and yes, we do, because it's not int input, it's int input 2 that we need to print out there. And I think that's it. So let's save that and let's recompile the keyboard test program. Keyboard test.java. That compiles. Let's test the program out. Keyboard test and run that. Okay, so this is our first test case. As I said, we've already tested that out. So let's just enter in the value 1. We're on to our second test case for the double value. Again, we already know that works, so I'm just going to enter in 2.5 for that. Now we're on to our third test case. Enter an integer value in the range 1 to 10. So let's get it wrong first. Let's enter in the value 20. So the value 20 is not in the range 1 to 10. And there we get our error message. Look, invalid entry. Enter in an integer value in the range 1 to 10. Okay, let's enter in the letter A. Okay, we get our error message, invalid entry. Enter in an integer value in the range 1 to 10. Okay, let's get it right this time. Let's enter the value 5. Okay, and there it goes. It works. Okay, so that is a valid entry. It is an integer number, and it's also in the range 1 to 10. So our program works, and we get our output saying you entered the value 5. Okay, so we took the code from the previous video. Remember, I've got a link to that previous video in the description below. And we took the idea of validating the user input, and we basically just wrapped a class and some methods around most of that code to make it reusable. So we now have a keyboard class, okay, that we've added 3 methods to: read integer, a read integer with a high and a low, to implement some kind of range validation, and of course then we have a read double. And we could go on and add lots of methods to this keyboard class for validating all different kinds of user input, but I think you get the idea of how we will go about doing this. So this now becomes a very reusable class that we can use in other programs, and we've kind of verified that in our little keyboard test program, because you can see we have our 3 test cases here. And if you have a look at the code actually for the keyboard test program, most of it is setting up variables just to do the test. All of the work is done just in one single call to the keyboard class. Okay, so you can see how useful this is. You can see now that any time we want to take input from the keyboard and validate it, we can just use this keyboard class, and it becomes really easy then to have user input validation. Okay, that's pretty much it. If you thought this video was useful, please subscribe to the channel. It's going to really help me in developing more videos. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to comment on the video, if there's something that you thought was good, something that you didn't think was very good, whatever, I'd be happy to hear your comments, so please leave a comment down below. Again, if you like the channel, if you think the videos are useful, hit the notification bell so that when I upload a new video you get notified, you don't miss out. I'm going to be uploading more videos very soon, so keep an eye on the channel. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching. See you next time.